On hearing of Boston's actions, Parliament's reaction was swift and harsh on the orders of the king, although the colonists still believed that Parliament was the one taking the lead, as they had been for the better part of the previous 150 years. The Boston Port Bill was passed in March of 1774 and closed the port of Boston to all trade until the tea was paid for and the participants brought to justice. The Massachusetts Government Act reduced the power of the colonial legislature and increased the power of the colonial governor, since the legislature didn't appear to be helping finding those who were responsible. The Administration of Justice Act would address concerns that royal officials accused of crimes would face unfair juries, and so they were allowed to have their trials moved to London and away from the growing resentment towards government officials in the colonies. And the fourth act that was passed as part of what becomes known as the Coercive Acts, the Quartering Act, was expanded, applying to all colonies and allowing soldiers to be housed in any private home, even without the owner's consent. The colonies called these four laws the Coercive Acts because they were meant to coerce the colonists into cooperation and submission. Alongside these coercive acts, Parliament also finally got around to organizing Canada that it had acquired at the end of the French and Indian War. In June of 1774, they passed the Quebec Act, which would do three basic things. First, it would recognize Catholicism as the official religion of Quebec, which means it would be a tax-supported religion, as opposed to the Church of England or the Anglican Church. Second, a government was created for Quebec, but it would be one that was entirely appointed and would not have a representative assembly. And third, the borders of what was defined as Quebec would be extended southward all the way to the Ohio River, taking land that had previously been claimed by several colonies. The colonists, although technically the Quebec Act didn't seem to apply to them, were particularly angry over these provisions, in part because, first, they were offended that Catholicism was being recognized by the British government. And remember, the king was the head of the English Church, which was Protestant. With regards to Quebec not having a representative assembly, many colonists were worried that similar laws could easily be passed affecting them and causing them to lose representation. They also felt that the Quebec Act was, in fact, a direct attack on them, taking away land that belonged to them, particularly Maryland, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, and even Pennsylvania, based on their original charters. And what was then to stop Parliament from eliminating those charters? So the Coercive Acts plus the Quebec Act are lumped together and called the Intolerable Acts. So the colonists responded to these intolerable acts, calling a Congress, the First Continental Congress, in September of 1774, where all of the colonies except for Georgia would meet in Philadelphia. Their plan was to come up with a united response to these threats to the rights and liberties that they perceived Parliament to be issuing against them. Effectively, they concluded that they wanted to return to the pre-French and Indian War conditions in terms of their relationship that they had with England and Parliament. It is important to note that none of the delegates who actually attended would have been considered loyalists. Loyalists would have felt that everything that Parliament was doing was perfectly allowable, because of course if they held that belief, they wouldn't have been chosen as a delegate, since the whole point of the Congress was to address the problems that Parliament was causing. Ultimately, this First Continental Congress took several actions. They enacted the Suffolk Resolves, which urged the colonists to resist by making military preparations and to once again begin boycotts. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which was a petition to the king begging him to make right colonial grievances and to restore their rights. In this declaration, the colonists did acknowledge Parliament's right to regulate trade, just not to do things such as internal taxes. They also established the Continental Association, sometimes just called the Association, which would create committees in every town whose job it was to enforce the economic sanctions that had been proposed by the Suffolk resolves. And they also promised that they would meet again the following spring if colonial rights were not restored. England's response to this First Continental Congress was to declare the colony of Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion and to send more troops. The colonies, it seems, were preparing for war, or at least Massachusetts was. And the rest of the colonies had to decide, would they come to support Massachusetts? One man in the Virginia House of Burgesses spoke in March of 1775, pleading with his fellow elected representatives from that colony, saying, "It is natural to man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren till she transforms us into the beast. I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging of the future but by the past. And judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years to justify those hopes with which gentlemen have been pleased to solace themselves in the House. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. Are fleets and armies necessary to a work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must be called in to win back our love? Let us not deceive ourselves. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last argument to which kings resort. What means this martial array if its purpose be not force us to submission? Are there any other possible motives for it? Has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of navies and armies? No, she has none. They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. We have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne, and implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and Parliament. Our petitions have been slighted, our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left to us. It is now too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard upon the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, let it come. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death. Patrick Henry's impassioned speech was a deciding factor in Virginia beginning to prepare for what he was calling an inevitable war. Yet not a single shot had actually yet been fired, although that was coming very soon. The city of Boston was occupied by the British Army, and the port remained closed to trade. But of course the surrounding countryside was not in the control of the British troops. Colonists, fearing possible conflict, had begun stockpiling weapons, ammunition, and gunpowder in the town of Concord, just 20 miles northwest of the city of Boston. Many people in the city had fled, but enough remained to continue to report on military activities, those committees of correspondence. Of course, not all the residents were patriots, so the commander of the troops, General Thomas Gage, was able to learn about the arsenal at Concord and decided to do something about it. He had also received information that Samuel Adams, whom he considered to be a particular rabble-rouser and an instigator of the Tea Party in Boston Harbor, along with John Hancock, also believed to have been behind the Tea Party and known as the King of Smugglers for bringing in so many smuggled goods to the city, avoiding the taxes issued by Parliament. Gage had discovered that they were staying with some of Hancock's family members in the nearby town of Lexington, and the road to Concord passed through Lexington, so Gage hoped that by sending troops very early in the morning, he could accomplish his goals of capturing the arsenal, as well as Adams and Hancock, all on the same mission. The city of Boston sits on a peninsula, connected to the mainland by a thin neck of land to the south. When sending a large contingent of troops towards Concord, Gage could have sent them one of two routes, sending them the longer overland route going along Boston Neck, or he could have ferried them on barges across the Charles River and then proceeded by land to Concord, a much shorter journey, and he opted for the latter. But keeping the movement of around 1,000 men a secret was going to be impossible. The Sons of Liberty were keeping watch, and quickly hatched their own plan to counteract. They would send their two best riders ahead of the British Army, William Dawes and Paul Revere, sending them on to Lexington to alert John Hancock and Samuel Adams of their impending arrest, as well as to alert the militiamen of the movement of troops towards that stockpile at Concord, so that it could be either moved or defended. But with military occupation came military curfews, which restricted when people could leave their homes. So Paul Revere devised a backup plan to make sure his message would leave Boston, even if he could not. He enlisted the help of additional riders, whom he placed across the river in Charlestown, and ordered the militia leaders to look to the steeple of the Old North Church every night for signal lanterns, the number of which would indicate how the British Army was leaving Boston and by which route. One lit lantern meant that the British would march over Boston Neck to the south. Two lit lanterns in the steeple meant that the British would take the shortcut across the Charles River into Cambridge, one if by land, two if by sea. The signal was technically a backup in case Revere and Dawes could not get out of Boston, but even though the signal would be lit for only a short period of time, it did get the message out. And both men were also able to get out of Boston themselves, with Revere sneaking across the river, and he began his own ride towards Lexington. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in '75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church tower as a signal light, one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. You know the rest. In the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again, under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For borne on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoof beats of that steed, and the midnight message of Paul Revere.